And we're back. This is 50 Questions with Your Legislators, and we're on to part two of my interview with Senator Lashrecse Aird. You don't want to miss the second half of these questions, so let's jump on in.
Okay, 2024 Woman of the Year, Senator Aird says Kamala Harris, everyone. Let's go back to 2016. I know, forever and a day ago.
That was a different life.
No, I know it. Can you talk to us about your experience being the youngest woman sworn into the Virginia House of Delegates?
You know, the hard part about 2016 for me is that by that time, I was popping my collar. I knew I could do the work. I knew I was equipped to serve. And I just had to convince everybody else, right? And so I felt, again, very affirmed by that time in who I was and who I am. But make no mistake about it, I had a lot of support. It was a lot of sweat equity. That first race was not a lot of money and a lot of organizations coming out of the woodworks. It was really me trying to demonstrate my skills and abilities to voters for the very first time. I have to give a lot of credit to Rosalind Dance, who was in the Senate at that time, who gave me my first legislative job. That's where my training comes from, my legislative acumen, my political acumen to some extent. And that's what equipped me to be able to step out there and say, what are we talking about? Like, I've been doing the work. I didn't just show up. I know these communities, so let's go. And so when I talked earlier about having certain experiences in my life that I now can look back and say prepared me for this moment, by that time I felt like I'd lived a whole life, and I had lived experience regardless of my age. And so oftentimes as the youngest woman, I'm going into meetings supposedly not speaking up because I'm young, supposedly not speaking up because I'm a woman. And I didn't know that, because I felt like my voice had value, my experiences had value. And so I would not shrink myself. And so I kind of came in a bit as a firestorm. And I would say, and I'm sure Delegate Price would say, we were very, very much coming in, trying to kick the door down. And we got a little bit of support following that in 19, and the rest is history.
Well, I hope that you guys continue to come in the rooms and kick these doors wide open. That's what I love to see.
Yes.
I would love to know what your most memorable moment as a delegate was.
I guess I have to talk about Breonna Taylor and Breonna's law, even though I actually have two. So before I get to Breonna's law. So in my early years as a delegate, I was fortunate enough to be put on the Appropriations Committee. And for people who don't know, that's the purse strings of the Commonwealth. It decides your spending priorities, your budgetary investments, so on and so forth. And there's a very public-facing committee process where the public is able to engage, and you get to hear about the direction that the spending is likely headed. But then there is a very closed door process that happens behind the scenes, small group meetings where legislators really get to sort of negotiate one-on-one about some of the spending priorities. And if you don't make it through that, the spending likely isn't going to happen. And I remember sitting around the table, young Black woman, nobody else sane in the room. And there was an effort to remove funding for an education program. And I remember the gentleman who wanted to remove this funding speaking with such confidence and such certainty that this program had no value. And for half a second, I debated speaking up, but it didn't take me long to get there to say, I just can't. And I talked about the fact that this was a beneficial program. It helps at-risk, students get college preparatory exposure. And I was challenged. And he sort of said, well, how would you know? Because this is for, poor kids or at-risk kids. And I had to look him in his eyes and say, I went through the program. I was that poor kid. I was that vulnerable kid. So I'm speaking from experience. And that was the first time the light sort of like went off glowingly that this is why I'm here. It is this moment where you're making $1 million funding decision. You have someone ready to strip a program away because they have no perspective, no understanding or exposure that this is how decision making works. And if you don't have that type of representation in the room, at the table, speaking up, this is how you don't get the support for communities that need it the most. So that's just one example. The other is Breonna's Law. As you know, the loss of Breonna Taylor was tragic and led to significant social unrest, both in our country and in this community. And I really felt deeply that policy should be moved forward that not only will allow us to remember her life in a positive way, to allow it to represent positive impacts, but then quite frankly, from a policy standpoint, the practice of allowing the use of no-knock search warrants is just a dangerous one. And so the legislation to move that forward was the first time I think I've been called sort of a liar from a decorum standpoint on the floor, was challenged in terms of the necessity. And anytime you're going up against a structure like law enforcement, that comes with its own set of obstacles to begin with, because regardless of whether you have good apples or bad apples, it's a structured institution that is comfortable as it's structured. But having said that, that was also the first time I was able to really learn how to bring together unlikely allies to move legislation forward. So it ended up being a very bipartisan bill. I actually ended up being able to work with my local law enforcement entity to prove that this was harmful and they don't even use the practice, which means that other entities could not use the practice and the world would not fall apart. And it gave me, I think, a new muscle in terms of collaborating in a intense environment where, you know, you are being challenged and you are being criticized, but to continue to push forward. And so those moments are two that I will never forget, because I just think the impact can't be understated.
For sure. Thank you so much for using your voice and being the representative.
I know, a long way of getting to the point, but I just, it's worth sharing.
No, it definitely is. And I'm sure our listeners are grateful to hear that. Thank you so much. Let's get into session. I know.
Well, you mean which part of the session? Because we're still technically
in session. Listeners, if you're watching this right now, we're still definitely in session.
Absolutely, right now.
But the beginning part of session, let's talk about how you felt your first General Assembly as senator this year.
Yes, I not even for myself, but for Virginia, was very proud entering this session. I was coming off of a race that I was running for maybe 2 years that was centered around freedom, centered around protecting our rights, multitude of rights, not just reproductive rights, but also restoring integrity to office, because the person I was running against really was a stain on our Commonwealth in terms of the types of people you should have in offices that are supposed to represent and mean something. And so I felt like we successfully did that. But more importantly, we had a sea change in terms of representation. More Black caucus members than we've ever had in history, more members under 50 than we've ever had in history, more seats being represented by new people for the first time than we've ever had at one time in history. And when you talk about the ability to move certain policies forward that previously could never even be considered, that means a lot for Virginia. And so I felt all of those things at once, and it was just quite glorious.
Yeah,
when the gavel hits and you jump into reality real quick.
That part That part for
It's like,
sure.
okay, bubble popped, come back to it, get to work now.
For sure. What unexpected roadblocks this year did you experience as you were trying to pass legislation?
Which one do I want to pick? So the Senate is different from the House. Let's just start there. I was raised in the House where it's a contact sport and you throw grenades and, you get into it and you get the work done. The Senate is a more collegial environment, more diplomatic, supposedly. And you have this environment where you're working together, but really I liken it to this. As someone who's from the North, and this is going to be a really poor example to use, but I'm just going to use it and people can judge me later. In the North, when someone is coming from you, they come to you from the front and they look at you and they say, I did this to you. I want you to see that I did this to you. In the South, they reach in for a handshake or a hug while they slide the knife in from the back. They don't want you to see you come. They don't want you to see them coming, and they don't want you to know it was them. That's the Senate.
That's a good perspective.
Okay, so the Southern charm is on high effect in the Senate, and the North, the I'm coming for you and you're gonna see me coming is the House. So as someone who is literally and figuratively very Northern bred, I struggle in the Senate. I'm very direct. I have a very strong personality. But that's not for everybody, right? And so, of course, to govern, you have to be able to set aside some of your natural approaches to both issues and actually getting things passed. And I struggle with that a little bit. And then I would say when you have a Democratic majority where you have only that majority by one seat, that also requires you to compromise in ways perhaps sometimes you may not want to, but if you don't, you risk killing far more legislation than you intend to. And so that was a bit difficult. But otherwise, I think everyone is getting their legs underneath them. We have the interim now to focus on bills that perhaps were not ready for prime time and needed a bit more work. And then unfortunately, because we have a Republican governor and we had so much legislation that passed with bipartisan support, but here we are, deja vu, we'll have to do it all over again in 25.
For sure. And stay tuned because there'll be a video on that too. But I definitely like what you said. I feel like it gives us listeners or anybody watching, LIS watching you guys in committee perspective on, the way that you guys vote sometimes that you may not want to vote for something, but then you realize that you're killing far more legislation. That's great information to have for an insider looking in.
Yes.
What kinds of legislation, getting into the legislation, what kind of legislation are you most looking forward to cultivating during your complete time as senator, even though your session has happened?
So my top two, I'll start with number one, is education. I am exhausted by the phrase, your zip code should not determine the type of education that you receive. We have been saying this since as long as I can remember. And I think it's criminal that we are in a state where, and quite frankly, there was a great article in the Richmond Times-Dispatch that talked about 70 years later, Brown v. Board, and the level of segregation that exists in our schools. I represent affluent school districts. I represent impoverished school districts. I represent small and rural school districts. And the disparity in the resources that exist in the spectrum of schools amongst those districts is very unfair. I would like to work on ensuring that the Commonwealth is living up to its constitutional responsibility as it pertains to investments in our schools, but also holding divisions accountable where there are levels of segregation that are largely have been accepted, but should be rectified. And then just as we see this flux in career readiness, industries changes, affordability for access to credentials changing. How do we ensure no one gets left behind? And so to me, education is the great equalizer. My number one issue is always going to be matters of education. Number two is not as sexy. I know people gloss over when I talk about it, but I hope people understand that we are living in a technologically disruptive period in time. I think it was just yesterday. I don't know when this will air, but I guess I'll say June 10th, when Apple rolled out its integration of ChatGPT into its OS level, mainframe system operating level. And people should recognize that that is serious. It is helpful. It will be an efficient tool. But when you talk about the more data that machines have access to be trained on and to be strengthened, that is a massive amount of data in your privacy and your behaviors that is being fed into these systems, which we're not going to talk about data centers today, but that's a whole nother conversation that matters to this. But I'll just close it by saying we will never be in this period of time that we are in again, where we have the opportunity to put a regulatory framework, a regulatory foundation in place relative to how we interact with this technology moving forward, how our schools, our healthcare systems, our state agencies, things we should be looking for, and the acceptable trade-off for access to this tool versus our privacy that we are comfortable with as Virginians and as a society. And so I'm spending a lot of time in the interim trying to figure out what that foundation and what that needs to look like in terms of guardrails, and especially for Black and Brown people, because we often find that by the time we learn about discrimination being baked into systems and into structures, it's too late. We are still trying to undo systems that were never built for us, systems that continue to work against us, foundations that cannot be relayed. I don't want that to be the fight of the next century, trying to relay foundations that's now existing in code and in machines and in data because we didn't get it right on the front end. A large part of me believes that the toothpaste is really already out the tube and we are a bit behind, especially as it compares to other countries. But I feel very deeply passionate about continuing to push forward on this front because this is the future and it will affect all of our lives, whether we want to talk about it or not.
No, for sure. And thank you for doing that work, because AI is something that is, from an artist standpoint, I've always been against it, but the implementation into it for our everyday lives, like you said, like all of this information that it's collecting, that is scary. Y'all need to be scared. Y'all are not scared enough for me. I'm scared.
And I don't think that there is a future where it doesn't exist, but I think the most that we can do is find the right balance, right? So some of the evolution of this technology will help us in ways that are unimaginable, but we should be the individuals who determine how we want that to be able to help us.
For sure. I could not have said it better myself.
And for your listeners, that doesn't mean I don't care about all the other things: healthcare, criminal justice reform, housing. All those things are on the list too. But if you want to know the top two that I care a lot about, it's those.
This session, you introduced SB 479, the Virginia Residential Landlord and Tenant Act. How would the proposed amendment to the to this bill empower localities to address instances of landlord noncompliance more effectively?
Yeah, so let me just start out by saying the short version is this is going after slumlords. Like this legislation, and shout out and kudos to my sister in service, Delegate Marcia Price, who carried this bill in the House before I carried it in the Senate for several years. And by the way, it's been passed several times. But this bill is about holding absentee property managers, absentee landlords accountable. Essentially, if you've ever known someone who was renting any kind of property where they had a rodent issue, where they had their heater not working, or holes in the roof, leaking roofs, damages to the property of any nature that made you feel like you were living in a less than a substandard housing. This basically is what this bill was targeting, and it basically allows the locality to go a bit further and issue violations to that property manager or to that property owner, mainly after there has been several efforts made to get this individual to rectify the property or the residence. And so ultimately, we have been through this, this bill a number of times, which it makes me very frustrated that we keep kicking the can down the road, because no one should live in deplorable conditions. And it should really not even be a fight to get someone to do the right thing by way of their tenants. But this basically is giving the locality more teeth to hold those individuals accountable.
Was definitely well needed in Virginia.
Yes.
Needed. SB 105, a bill you chief co-patron, has passed both the chambers. Can you elaborate on the rationale behind establishing the at-risk program?
Yeah, and so the at-risk add-on program was really designated and structured for school divisions that can be considered to have significant financial need. This is to allow those divisions, and by the way, to be clear, the at-risk add-on program has been around for quite some time, but this was just to work to structure how the funds could be further specified and further structured in very specific school divisions based on a formula and ratio of need to ensure, again, those school divisions that need additional resources the most for certain support positions, support certain resources that they want to offer within the school, that they get that. So not really the creation, but making sure the money from this program is going where we need it the most is really the intent there.
We would love to know how this bill would directly impact teachers and students.
Yeah, so basically, the local school division gets to decide how this money is used, but it's significantly flexible, right? So if you need additional dollars to go towards, let's just say a support staff position, you're able to pull money from this pot. Because some categories of funding are specifically designated for certain uses, they're not as flexible. This gives greater flexibility to that school division. And ultimately, it does support teachers, it does support schools to bring in those resources that are necessary, especially in school divisions where they don't have a place to get this money otherwise.
Moving right along, your bill SB 480 addressed the disconnection of utility services. Can you tell us more about that bill?
Yeah, this is one of my favorites from this session because as someone who has experienced utility disconnection in my life, and as someone who has seen during the pandemic, in particular, individuals experience their utilities being disconnected, to me, that seems inhumane. So this legislation ensures that during extreme weather events or during public health emergencies, that no utility, water, gas, electric, you name it, can disconnect an individual service. And it goes a bit further in trying to streamline, which we learned that largely these utilities are already in the practice of doing, but it ensures that these utility companies offer a means to remedy, past due balances or whatever, situation led you to be even facing disconnection to begin with. So I just think that this goes a long way to ensure we have a uniform policy across the Commonwealth, and you don't end up with some communities experiencing disconnection while some are not, and just ultimately putting people and families in a really precarious position when it's most critical.
it definitely sucks that we have to have legislation to have people be more humane, but we're very glad that it is in place and letting people.
Confident poverty is a real thing.
How does this policy, SB 480, contribute to ensuring safety and the well-being of affected individuals and communities?
Yeah, I mean, self-explanatory, right? During the pandemic, what were we saying? Wash your hands, use as much water as possible. If you ain't got water, you can't do any of those things. Or, just basic life needs cannot be met if you don't have access to water, which is why back when I was in the House, we started with a resolution declaring access to water a human right. And we did that because you really cannot survive if you don't have access to water. And so from a very practical standpoint, something like having access to your utilities, that really affects the quality of life of an individual. And so we want to do all that we can to keep people in a position to have those things and those resources as they need it.
For sure. Moving on to a topic very near and dear to my heart. Anytime we start talking about Black women, I get a little. SJ 23 establishes Black Maternal Health Week in Virginia. Please talk about the importance of this.
So this is also equally important. I think my very first experience with maternal health was listening to the chairman of the Appropriations Committee at that time ask me, why did I care about this, since I believe in abortion, which is kind of wild when you think about it, because on the spectrum of reproductive health, the two they're not the same, right? So I say all that to say I've been in this fight for maternal health for quite some time now, but we have still yet to really make the dent in outcomes that is saving the lives of Black women, of women, and of their children. And so the whole point in designating this week is to raise awareness and to continue to keep this, I think, tragic matter in the forefront of both policymakers and the general public. I believe when you can change the heart and mind of practitioners, those that are in the space of doing this work, that is ultimately also when you'll see a difference in outcomes. I also believe our systems and structures are not often or always set up in a way that are supportive of combating this challenge. And I give you the example of we had a task force meeting where I think the director of DMAS talked about the fact that physicians' offices are oftentimes only opened on business hours. Let that sit with you. If you are a working mom, if you're a working pregnant individual, and you want to seek your prenatal care, you want to seek your care generally, you have to take off work or you don't get to make an appointment at all, which can delay the level of care that you need. And when they surveyed physicians to try and get them to change their working hours, many of them were unwilling to do so, which is a whole, industry question, and it's understandable. But step one, how do you prevent infant and maternal mortality if individuals can't even get into the doctor to see doctors because they're not available at hours that are actually conducive to working women? So we have a lot of work to do on that front in a multitude of ways, but that resolution is to ensure we continue to talk about this and know that we've not arrived at our destination of combating this challenge.
For sure. I would love to talk about conference assignments. As someone, on the outside looking in, you had 12 conference assignments this legislative session. And I'm so curious, please talk to us about how conference committees work and why so first of all, lacking in transparency.
So for those watching, a conference committee is formed once a bill or a policy has gone through the traditional legislative process. Think how a bill becomes a law. But let's stop short at before it gets out of receiving enough votes from both bodies to make it to the governor's desk. This happens when one chamber believes that the policy approach language should occur in one way, and then the other. So basically, like the House of Delegates believes one approach, the Senate believes one approach, and we're not in agreement. So a conference committee is formed for those individuals to negotiate the final language and to recommend back to both of those bodies the pathway forward. So lacking transparency is accurate. There is not continued meetings that you can view or advocate as part of, and you don't know what the final recommendation is going to be until it's made public. Oftentimes what that looks like on the back end is the patron of the legislation in that conference committee having maybe a small work group meeting or having conversations sometimes in passing to come up with that final language. And so what I will say is also the difference in the Senate is there are only 40 members. And so the workload is far more significant. And so while I want to say, oh, I'm on 12 conference committees because I'm just that amazing, I really think it's more likely a workload matter. We try, I know Madam Chair tries to either put you on conference committees where you have a certain perspective to offer, you serve on the committee where the bill was heard, so you have the benefit of hearing public testimony, or somehow you were tied to understanding that legislation. So that is oftentimes how that conference committee is put together and structured.
Okay, thank you so much for that insight. We needed to.
Yes.
I'd like to talk about SB 487. Can you give us some background on what sparked the need for this particular bill?
So for this, you heard me talk just a few moments ago about my love and passion for artificial intelligence and my, I think my desire to put guardrails and regulations in place. I've introduced study legislation in the past. Oops. Somehow hit the screen and lost you for a second. And this was my attempt to say, hey, you know what? You all are taking too long to get us to the place where we need to be. So here's my best attempt and shot at trying to actually put some of those guardrails in place myself. And so that legislation is what that is. And the final version is actually me combining legislation with Senator Pillion, who wanted to establish an AI task force. So that legislation actually did not move forward because of the fiscal impact, but you will see it again.
Oh, we do. Let's move on to SB 595. This is a bill they introduced with Senator Bagby. Can you talk to us about the work that went behind creating this bill?
So this is about making sure that as localities are developing their comprehensive plans, which truly is a vision for how you will invest and build up any particular community, that you also take into health impacts, right? That you also take into account environmental needs, and that strategy is baked into that plan as well. Not just buildings, not just investing in companies, not just elements of the plan that, outlines your financial investments, but that you also take a people perspective, a people aspect of how they will be affected by increased building, less parks or more parks, and that strategy is incorporated into the planning as well. So just being really more deliberate about the comprehensive plan development process, which all localities go through, and we're incorporating that consideration as well.
Perfect. In what ways do you think this legislation will further environmental efforts in our Commonwealth?
Yeah, I just think, and I'll just take the conversation that's happening right now around solar farms, around data centers, as we are seeing increased demand in our Commonwealth for certain types of industries. You have to also account for how you're going to keep people healthy. You're going to keep your environment, the breathing air, where landfills will and will not go, all of those things with great intentionality. So,
for sure. You sat on a few committees this year. I would love to know which one was your favorite.
Education and health, easily. That's where my natural policy interest is aligned. And so whenever I get to really get into the core of that work, I'm obviously in a happy place. Most fascinating, definitely courts of justice. I mean, you're just hearing a spectrum of all the wildest things you can imagine oftentimes. And the thing is, it's not my expertise, but I have learned so much on that committee already in just one session. And so those would be the top two that I would reference.
Our time is coming closer and closer to a close, and I don't want you to leave. Before you go, are there any funny stories about Virginia politicians that you can share with me?
Oh, now you want me to dish out tea and be messy here. I don't know that there are any that I can safely tell. So I think I'm going to avoid that like the plague.
Safe. Okay, I understand your job is important. We want to know, especially us here at PV, what is next for Senator Aird? Is there anything in the works that we can hear about?
I think the only thing that I would say is I'm spending the rest of this time getting to know this new district. I have 7 localities and they're all very different. So unlike when I was in the House, Eastern Henrico, Varina, Highland Springs, and Sandston is the largest part of my district. And also have Charles City, Hopewell, Petersburg, Dinwiddie, Prince George, Sussex, Surrey, and in all of these areas, especially the ones that I've not represented before, they extended a great deal of trust in me despite not entirely knowing me. And so I feel obligated to now get back out there, make sure that I can spend the time with them, I can get to know them so that they know their vote wasn't in vain and that I'm doing the work for them.
We can definitely tell that you are putting in all of the work that needs to be done. I'm so
thank you so much.
Of course. Before we wrap things up, we'd like to know, who's your favorite interviewer?
You, of course. Like, is that even a question?
I think not, but I always have to ask. And where would you go for up-to-date information on all things progressive in Virginia?
Oh my goodness. No else but here. This is the source. This is where you always should go. And if you're not, you're losing.
You're losing. You heard it here first from Senator Aird. Progress Virginia is where you need to be.
Progress Virginia. If you're not checking for Progress Virginia, you're losing.
You're losing. Thank you so much, Senator Aird, for joining us. I hope I get the pleasure of speaking with you again very soon.
Take care.
Another politician after my own heart. Everybody give it up for Senator Lashrecse Aird. A champion in our Commonwealth. She's doing everything that needs to be done to keep our Commonwealth more progressive. Thank you to Senator Aird and others like her. This has been 50 Questions with Your Legislators, and we're going to keep this ball running for a while. Make sure you stay tuned for the next episode. It could be your district with your legislator.